Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with John Sweet, the author of The Sewing Girl's Tale, a story of crime and consequences in revolutionary America. This is his second book and has won many prizes, including the Journal of the American Revolution's Book of the Year for 2022. He is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina. Go Tar Heels. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Sweet.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Before we start this discussion in earnest, I do want to warn anyone who may be further traumatized by hearing discussion of rape and the circumstances surrounding it, that this may not be the best podcast to listen to, in all honesty, but I'm certainly going to try to do my best to make this conversation as palatable and as informative as possible so that we can understand why the story of Lanah Sawyer is so important and so consequential. So first of all, before this rape happened in September of 1793, Dr. Sweet, who was Lanah? Where did she live? And what kind of life did society expect her to live?
So Lanah Sawyer was 17 in the fall of 1793. She grew up in New York City. She was actually born in the city in 1776, around the time the British invaded. So she grew up in a military-occupied city. Her father died when she was about 7 years old, right at the end of the war. So she grew up largely in a family having suffered that loss, and then her mother quickly remarried. So then she was living with a stepfather and half siblings. By 1793, for example, there was a new baby in the house that she would have spent part of her time taking care of. It was a modest working family. Her stepfather was a branch pilot. There still are branch pilots in New York City that guide ships into harbor. So it was a solid working class family. And she was working as a seamstress in order to help the family make ends meet at that time.
And what would society have expected, not necessarily of her, but of a young woman growing up at that time, potentially symbolically born during this very consequential year of 1776?
It's hard to say exactly what society expected of a young woman like Lanah Sawyer. There's actually very sparse documentation on the lives of working class women during this period. We know a lot more about elite women than we do about Black women and working class white women. So she certainly was growing up in a period when there were pretty rigid sexual mores, in which young men had a lot of sexual license and young women's chastity was very highly valued. But it's more complicated than that, as we may discuss. She lived at a time when a woman who didn't have substantial capital had really no way of making ends meet on her own, except by working as a prostitute. There was really no respectable work that a single woman could do unless she inherited money that would support herself. For example, working as a seamstress was a profession that could, wages were so low for a woman in this period that she could earn something like a third of her household expenses. So she would have expected to marry. The woman in her family married young, around the time they were 17. So she may well have been thinking about marriage at this point, early point in her life.
What was the legal definition of rape during that time, and how had that definition changed over the decades and perhaps over the centuries?
Yeah, I was really interested in this, and I was curious to know if New York had written a new statute on rape after the Revolution. And the answer is they had not. So in New York in 1793, rape was defined as it was under English law prevailing at the time of the Revolution. And in fact, the English law was ancient. The English law was almost 500 years old. It was written in 1285, and it was a very simple definition of rape as sexual coercion of a woman above the age of consent, or any kind of sexual activity with a woman below the age of consent. So the technical language was carnal knowledge of a woman against her will was the key term. But the point is but what carnal knowledge means is intercourse by the penis and vagina. But the key phrase there is against her will.
If prostitution is the oldest profession, we hear that phrase all the time, is rape the oldest crime?
I don't know. What I can say is, prostitution was big business in this period. And it's interesting that there are these two sets of issues, prostitution and sexual assault, that both involve a lot of sexual shame, and are both often kind of interconnected. In this period, for example, one of the kind of cultural mythologies of how madams recruited young women to work for them as prostitutes was by conniving at their seduction or rape, and then telling them that, oh, well, now that you've been ruined, you have no future prospects, you'll never get married, you have no respectable options in life, you might as well come and work for me, and at least you'll have a roof over your head. So that was a classic kind of cultural script that was told in this period. It wasn't true.
Let's have you explain who is Lanah Sawyer and who is Harry Bedloe. First, though, explain what we know about the early life, as much as we can piece together, of Lanah Sawyer.
So I'll just begin by saying that this is a classic story of an acquaintance rape, or what we might call a date rape. And I first encountered the story in the 1980s, right around the time Ms. Magazine coined the term date rape. And so there's a lot of, and I was struck at the time, and have been struck since, by how familiar this dynamic sounds. If I could just paint the scene a little bit. One day, late in the summer of 1793, this 17-year-old working young woman, Lanah Sawyer, was walking down Broadway in New York City. It had been a rainy day, so that presumably there was a break in the rain. And she attracted the attention of a group of Frenchmen who began to harass her. They catcalled. As she later said, she didn't understand what they were saying, but she knew what they meant. And as they were catcalling her, this young gentleman intervened. He rescued her. He escorted her home. He was well dressed. He had fashionable, very high style, white powdered hair. He took her home and asked her out for a walk a few days later.
He was cool, basically, right?
Well, he was clearly rich. Clearly, he was charming, young gentleman. But when he introduced himself, he didn't give her his real name. He made up a name. He said, "My name is Lawyer Smith," which has an L and an S, like Lanah Sawyer. So you know where he got that idea. But he wasn't Lawyer Smith. He was actually well known in the city as a sexual predator. His real name was Henry Bedloe. So he was trying to sneak under her radar in a city of about 40,000 people, where she would have known him by reputation. She certainly did know him by reputation, but she didn't know him by sight. And a few days later, they went out on that walk. And it's clear that she was, kind of excited about the prospect and flattered by his interest. And it started out innocently enough. They took a glass of ice cream, which at the time was a novelty in the city, and they walked around the Battery, which had only in a few years earlier been turned into a public park, very much as it is today.
And she was of the station where she was, someone who would have been somewhat taken by having the interest from somebody like, and I'm going to use the name he gave, like this Lawyer Smith.
baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I can see how she would have been flattered and intrigued. There was also good reason for suspicion. I think she was concerned that her parents would be suspicious of why this gentleman was paying attention to her. So instead of waiting inside the house and letting him knock on the door and be introduced to her parents, she sat on the stoop and waited for him so she could kind of slip away. So I think there was a mixture of emotions. I think, is excited and flattered. And I think she, had a personality where she felt entitled to possibilities. I think she felt she was a 17-year-old, so perhaps a little rebellious, but I think she wasn't somebody who felt like, oh, I need to marry the butcher down the street because he's of my station. I think she was thinking like, oh, well, maybe my life might take a different path and I'm good enough for that.
And you used a term in the book. I guess I'd heard it, but I never really knew what it meant. The term rake. Explain what a rake is and how she might have thought him to be a rake.
So there's a rake is a term that was very common in the late 18th century. And it was the kind of the basis of the most popular form of fiction at the time, which was the seduction story. And the newspapers and magazines and novels at the time were full of seduction stories. And a seduction story features the rake as kind of an evil, seduction story features the rake as an evil character who is almost always a gentleman who has a certain charm, who feigns interest in a young woman in order to seduce her into having sex with him. And then he abandons her and leaves her ruined. Typically in a seduction narrative, he goes on and lives the rest of his life, and she dies as a consequence of this liaison. She's cast out of her family. She becomes pregnant and alcoholic, or pregnant and insane, or pregnant, insane, and alcoholic, falls into a life of prostitution. But in any case, she dies shortly thereafter. So the rake is kind of like the figure of Satan, who is trying to convince the sinner to sign his book. And once that's happened, the individual is ruined. This is nothing like anything we really have a modern. So the rake takes pleasure in the ruin of his victims. There was a famous novel, Dangerous Liaisons, which was a well-known movie a generation ago, about this kind of sexual predation. Today, there's no real equivalent. Rake is used in romance novels today to mean kind of like a bad boy aristocrat who turns out to have a heart of gold. There is no heart of gold in the 18th century rake. The term comes from what happens if you rake the coals of hell. That's what you end up with, is the rake.
So before we get to the rest of that incident that you were describing from September of 1793, right? September 93. Before we get to the rest of that incident, they're on this walk and, they're kind of walking around Manhattan, and we'll pick it up from there. But I wanted to just first ask, talk more about Harry Bedloe. Who was he and what made him sort of this gentleman? And I'm using quotes around it. That might be how he was perceived by some of society. What family was he born to? And as I asked about Lanah, what was the life she was expected to lead? What was the life Harry Bedloe was expected to lead? And who was he? Who was he born to?
Right. So Henry Bedloe was born in 1767. He's
9 years older than her. Yeah.
Yes, he was in his mid to late 20s. He At the time he was born, he was from an affluent family. His father was a ship captain and small-scale merchant. His mother was a daughter of the Rutgers family that owned substantial brewery businesses in Lower Manhattan and an enormous farm in the area between Two Bridges and the Manhattan Bridge, what's now the Rutgers housing development. So they had plans from the 1750s early to subdivide that parcel, rent it out for long-term leases, and hold it, which was the way a lot of the great New York fortunes of the 19th century were created. John Jay, for example, Trinity Church, Wall Street. So she was from a family that was a rich family that was destined for enormous wealth in the early 19th century. So when Henry Bedloe was born, his parents had been trying to have children for many, many years. They had a series of miscarriages and children that died early after birth. So when he was born, his father wrote in the family Bible, "I pray that he may live and grow up in holiness." And Henry Bedloe did at least live. But there's no indication that there was anything ever holy about him. He pretty much left I think of him like a snail. He kind of left a trail of slime behind him his entire life. And so, but he was a gentleman because of his social status, because of his family's wealth, and because of his station. Gentleman didn't mean you were a nice guy or an honorable dude. It meant you didn't have to work with your hands for a living.
So now let's pick up the story. They're on this walk. I guess it's the night of September 4th, but headed into the morning of September 5th. And as best we can piece together, and again, this part might be sensitive, but as best we can piece together what happened that night.
Yeah, I'll just make it clear that in the book, the actual assault is really never described. There's a brief narration of the assault during the trial in Lanah's testimony, but the book is organized so that the assault is not the center of the story, that the center of the story is Lanah's response. And centering Lanah as the subject of the book was really important to me, making it clear that she did have a backstory, that this was an incident that she approached and with a set of inner resources and familial resources. And she took a very unusual path. And so part of the question I was intrigued in this book is, why did she follow the path she did? And how did she get the resources and the family support to do that? But to answer your question, Evan, so Henry Bedloe and Lanah Sawyer were walking around the Battery. They clearly were having a good time because a lot of time passed. And eventually, Lanah heard church bells ringing and was like, "Oh my God, it's midnight. My parents locked the front door at 10. I'm going to be in big trouble. I got to get home." And he made a big show of how he was going to walk her home. So they headed up Broadway. This is a time when almost everybody in Manhattan lived below what's now City Hall Park. So nothing was more than about a mile away from anything else, a 20-minute walk. But instead of turning down John Street, which was her cross street, they kept going up to what's now the tip of City Hall Park, was then just a field. They were trying to turn an old cow pasture into a public park. And then he steered her down, had his arm around her, he steered her down Ann Street, which was a very disreputable street, very crooked street, dark, narrow, disreputable. And she said, "No, I don't want to go down Ann Street. That's not a respectable street." And he forced her. And she says in her testimony that this is when I realized that I wasn't with some lawyer Smith. She had been warned that this guy might be Henry Bedloe, and she realized, oh my God, he really is Henry Bedloe. And she screams, and he covers her mouth to quiet her. And so the evening ends with him dragging her to a brothel around the corner, just 2 blocks away from where her family lived. And the madam refuses them entry in the front door. But Bedloe was persistent, and eventually Lanah keeps struggling and running away. He keeps running after her and dragging her back. He eventually drags her in the back of the brothel, back door of the brothel, where she's assaulted.
You tell this vivid story of how, and I guess I was, really taken by, this detail you gave, where she is then able to use the next morning her main skill, which is sewing, to help herself after the incident. What does that say about who she was and what and who she would have to rely on in order to get through this very terrible experience?
Yeah, the next morning there's a really telling scene, and I actually begin the book with it. So the room is completely dark. So it's very hard to tell what time it is. She tried to find a way out of the room over the night, but she couldn't figure out how to get the window open or the door open. They were locked. In the morning, Henry Bedloe opens the window shutters, light streams in, and says, you better get out of here, get yourself dressed and get out of here. I'm getting dressed, I'm leaving. The brothel keeper is not going to want you around her house. And he leaves. And Lanah sits there in this little room and takes stock. And she realizes that her clothes, her gown, her dress had been ripped. Some of the strings that kind of held it together had been torn off. So she sits there and spends a while kind of emotionally composing herself and using her needle and thread to physically repair the damage done to the gown. I think the damage done to the gown is really significant, although I didn't realize that until a lot later. And then when she's ready, she steps out into the hallway, and there's a really interesting scene where the madam approaches her with this kind of casting herself in this role of the older woman who's going to take care of Lanah, casting her in a role as a young woman who's supposed to be ashamed. She says, "Dearie, you can go out the back door if you like, and no one will see you. Or I can check and see if there's anybody out in the street in the front." And Lanah's response is astonishing. What she says is, "No." She's completely defiant. She's, "No, I will go out the front door, and I don't care who sees me, even if it's my father."
Yeah, I was struck by that. Yeah.
So she's able to summon a kind of bravado that it's both Mother Carey didn't really expect, and I think that Henry Bedloe didn't really expect. Part of the reason the story developed the way it did is because Henry Bedloe really, if Lanah Sawyer misperceived who Harry Bedloe really was, because he lied to her, Harry Bedloe misperceived who Lanah Sawyer was. He thought she'd be a lot more compliant and a lot less willing to stand up for herself, a lot more consumed by sexual shame than she turned out to be.
And, that detail of being able to rely on herself, does that kind of foreshadow this ensuing fight that she has coming up, that she's going to have to use her own strength, unfortunately, to get this without a larger community around her?
It's interesting you put it that way. I think I would say that one of her great strengths was her ability to recruit allies. And I think that another thing we often forget or pass over quickly is how traumatic an experience like this can be. So Lanah spent that. So when Lanah walked out the front door, having just told off Mother Carey, who's the name of the brothel keeper, that she didn't care who saw her. Once she got out the front door onto the stoop, she was terrified. And she knew she had to go home. She knew she had to tell her parents what had happened, but she was also terrified that her stepfather, who was a particularly violent individual, would beat her up and kick her out without listening to her. So she spent pretty much all that day, kind of reeling from shock and disorientation, and trying to collect herself enough that she could go back home and hopefully try and talk to her mother first. So she spent some time sitting on the grass overlooking the Hudson River. A gentleman approached her because he was afraid she was suicidal and asked her to tell him her story. She refused. She then went to, this was an aspect of her family I didn't mention earlier, but she went to visit her aunt, who lived on the Bowling Green with another widow named Mrs. Bruce. And both Lanah's aunt, Mrs. Dykeman, and this other widow, Mrs. Bruce, were very rich, socially prominent women. Mrs. Bruce was the aunt of Alexander Hamilton, for example, from a very rich and powerful family. So, and Lanah spent the afternoon in that household, probably sewing and listening to the ladies chat and read. But part of the point is that Lanah had this social connections to the city's elite. And her uncle, in fact, had been one of the city's aldermen, which is the equivalent of a current council member. And the council members were who you would report a crime to. We haven't mentioned the fact there was no police in this period. So it's one of the city's magistrates that you would report a crime to. So Lanah clearly had experience through her family with crime and the prosecution process. And she was comfortable with some of the city's richest and most prominent people.
When it comes to stories about things that have happened, more than 200 years ago, I'm always curious to ask, what were your sources for this? Before we get back to some of the narrative of how this all unfolds afterwards, what were your sources for this book? And I have to say, I've read a lot of these. You really wrote beautifully and just incredible detail, and it was really captivating prose and language. So you should know that. But what did you use to piece this all together, and how did you extract all these amazing details out of your primary sources, and I guess secondary sources too?
Yeah, I had a long research process, so this book took me forever to write and research. I'm always, gratified when people have a positive response, because when you're writing a book, you have no idea if it's going to work or connect to people. I had two basic goals in my research. I wanted to find out as much as I could about Lanah, her life, her trajectory, the state of the law, what the trial was like. So I wanted to know I wanted to understand the different characters and what their motivations and backgrounds were that shaped the action in the story. So there was a whole set of research questions I had. So I read novels to understand, newspapers and magazines to understand seduction stories. I wanted to understand everybody's social connections. So I researched, which was a lot of work, where everybody lived. So I figured out where everybody lived, and I mapped them on a big GIS thing. So I could kind of see who was living in whose neighborhood and how far people went. I also wanted readers to be able to visualize this story, because it takes place so long ago and the city was so different in 1793. So I wanted to, whenever I could, give a sense of the weather and the smells and the look and the physical character. One little story I can tell you that was really gratifying. I had a lot of disheartening moments when I first went to the Department of Finance, where the real estate records are held, and they sent me up to this room that was just an empty, cavernous room full of these records, and I must have looked like I was about to cry, because a woman who was the only other person in the room was a professional title searcher, and she looked at me and she said, "Honey, what you want?" And I told her what I wanted, and she's like, "Oh, it's over there. Look over there." And I said, "Oh, can I just hire you to do this?" And she's like, "Honey, you can't afford me." But another great moment I had in the research process was I was really trying to understand Lanah's gown. And I was intrigued by the description of the gown in the trial as a calico gown, which means a cotton gown, probably printed, with a drawn frill around the neck. So it had some kind of ornament around the neck. And it was described as being held together by pins that had been torn out by Henry Bedloe when he pulled the gown off of Lanah, and strings that had been torn when Henry Bedloe tore the gown off. And when I first started in my amateur way researching women's clothing in the 1790s, I just came up against a mystery, because fashion historians talk about the 1770s and 80s, and they talk about the late 1790s and early 1800s, but they kind of skip this middle period because it's kind of a transition period, and it's unclear who was wearing what at this point. And those of you who are familiar with kind of Revolution era dramas know that these very tight, funnel-waisted, tightly structured gowns with the big skirts are kind of the mid-18th century fashion. And from Jane Austen or Bridgerton, you probably are familiar with the loose diaphanous empire style gown that is unstructured and flowing. And Lanah Sawyer's gown was somewhere in between those two styles. And I ended up going to make an appointment and seeing Linda Baumgarten at Colonial Williamsburg, who's the great expert on clothing in this period. And she was so sweet and so patient and so kind and so generous with her time. And she sat there and answered all my questions. And I went through all the descriptions in the trial record that we know. And she puzzled over what they could possibly mean and told me what the gown probably looked like. She said it was probably a round gown, blah, blah, blah. And she drew me some sketches. And anyway, I'm super grateful to her. And then she's like, so I had thought I was done because she had told me what the gown looked like. And then she's like, but that's not really what's most interesting about this gown. And I said, really?
Uh-oh.
What is the most interesting about this gown? And she said two things. One, pretty much no one wore underwear in the 18th century. So under Lanah's skirt and her petticoats, there would have been no drawers. Henry Bedloe would have had no drawers on. So you didn't need to disrobe in order to have intercourse. He could have just pulled up her skirts, but he chose not to. He wanted her naked. That tells you something about his sexual aim. And second, the gown was torn. And for Linda Baumgarten, this was the most important thing. And I've talked to a bunch of other costume experts since then who said the same thing, that the fabric is really expensive in this period. And for a working class woman like Lanah, this was probably her best dress, probably one of only maybe 2 or 3 dresses that she owned. It really doesn't make any sense to imagine that she would have damaged her own gown in a fit of passion. The only reasonable explanation for how that gown got torn is that Henry Bedloe tore it while removing it against her will. So the gown became very strong evidence to me, of the strength of the prosecution case. And in fact, gown was the only piece of forensic evidence introduced at trial.
Why did you want to write a narrative history book as opposed to an academic book? Surely there have been academic studies done on this case. Why did you think it was important to tell this story in a narrative and colorful way?
There have indeed been good scholarly articles and books that discuss this case. And I really got interested in researching this case about 15 years ago when I was working with a graduate student who turned up a piece of information in a newspaper from 5 years after the rape trial that really threw my assumptions into a kind of a loop, threw my assumptions for a loop, and really challenged my assumptions about what had actually happened back in 1793. So I approached this to begin with as a kind of as an open research question, a kind of a mystery that I was trying to understand. Your question was about why this is written as a narrative. At the time I started writing this book, I was really intrigued by the power of storytelling and the potential of different kinds of stories to populate our common understanding of American history. I think we've had a lot of founding father biographies, a lot of stories about battles, but we don't have a lot of stories about Black women, about working class white women in this period. And so I was interested in what kind of story I could write that would be rigorously grounded in historical evidence. I wasn't interested in, I have no imagination. I'm not a novelist. But I was interested in using kind of novelistic styles to present historical evidence. And that, that required a different kind of research and a different kind of strategy. You're absolutely right. But I was really storytelling is central to the story at every level. It was a challenge for me trying to figure out how to tell this story in a way that would be engaging to readers and sensitive to the subject and keep Lanah's perspective at its core. But for Lanah herself, storytelling was a key issue. She grew up with these cultural scripts about what sexual virtue for a woman meant. Once this assault happened, many modern memoirists like Chanel Miller and others have talked about how the experience of an acquaintance rape can be so disorienting because you thought you knew this guy and then it turns out you didn't know this guy, and it can really mess with your sense of your own calibration of reality. So Lanah's got to come to terms with making a story for herself of what had happened that makes sense of these facts that didn't really make sense. And then she's got to craft a narrative that is authentic, but is also going to satisfy the needs of her parents and recruit them as allies. And she ended up being very successful at that. And as further she goes towards a prosecution, the more the criteria for the kind of story she tells have already been pre-established in legal culture. And even after the rape trial, there are competing versions of events. It's very much like, for history today, it's very much like, in some ways, the E. Jean Carroll trial, in which there's a whole battle that develops between Lanah Sawyer and Henry Bedloe after the rape trial over both civil damages and then also over a battle over the historical reality of truth.
You said this was the first time in American history that someone had been charged with rape without police around. You said there were no police. How does someone get to a point where charges are filed, and who do you file the charges with?
Yes. So this was the first time in New York City in about 50 years that a gentleman had been charged with rape. There had been other rape trials in New York City and attempted rape trials in New York City, although convictions were hard to come by. But this was the first time a gentleman in the city had been prosecuted for rape in about 50 years. So what is the prosecution process? First, the typical process is you would make a complaint in the absence of constables and police officers. What you did was you went to one of the city's aldermen, or the mayor, the head alderman, and filed a complaint with them. So you literally had to go knock on their door and get their attention. And typically, this was done in company with the father of the victim. When mothers tried to accompany their daughters in the absence of a husband, the reception they got was often quite skeptical. So you would go to the magistrate, the alderman. The alderman would hear the case or hear your claim. And in that sense, it's similar to going to the police in a modern criminal justice situation, where you pass a series of gatekeepers. You've got to persuade a series of people with escalating levels of responsibility and escalating consequences that your case merits being taken seriously and merits being moved along towards prosecution. But it's also the case that it's also the fact that once you start a criminal prosecution, you begin to lose control over your own case, over your own story. It becomes a matter for the mayor to make a decision about and to opine about whether he or not he's going to refer the matter to the district attorney, for example. So in this case, the mayor made his own kind of investigation. He summoned the brothel keeper, brought her before him, interrogated her. I think it was clear to him that she was lying to him. And I think that bolstered his sense that of the strength of Lanah's case. And he eventually, Henry Bedloe arrived at the mayor's office, trying to file counter charges against Lanah's stepfather. And the mayor dismissed those and sent the rape charge on to the district attorney to be heard by a grand jury.
How did, and I don't know how much you want to get into the trial. We don't have a ton of time, unfortunately, but what was the reaction to this? How did this start to spread through, the culture of New York? And, I read that there were riots and demonstrations because of this. How did New York City react to this first time that a gentleman, in quotes, strong quotes, was charged with rape?
So I think during the trial was a sensation. It lasted about 15 hours, took place in one day. So it started about 10 o'clock in the morning, ended around 1 o'clock at night. And as the official report of the trial says, or the published report of the trial says, after a 15-hour trial, the jury took 15 minutes to deliberate. And I think that a lot of people were surprised that the verdict was not guilty, because I think Lanah had been very convincing during the trial, and the prosecution had thrown a lot of mud at her.
And she testified herself?
She did. She was the key witness. Bedloe, in this period, defendants were not allowed to testify, so he didn't testify, but they brought other witnesses, and mostly spent the trial attacking her basically flawless reputation. So the trial itself is interesting as a matter of legal strategy, but the outcome provoked enormous outrage in the city. And I've looked and I've seen nothing like this, at least earlier. A week after the trial, something like 600 working men, something like 1 out of 10 adult men in the city rioted. In riots that lasted all night, they demolished the brothel in which the assault had taken place. In these days, you didn't loot, you literally broke everything apart. So there was a cloud of bed feathers left in the morning and a pile of scrap lumber taken away by poor people for firewood. Second night, there was another series of riots attacking other brothels. This provoked a really extraordinary newspaper war in which the argument was about, these bad working people, disorderly rabble, taking justice into their own hands. How illegitimate is that? And the working men of the city writing back, well, if you people would prosecute rapists properly, we wouldn't have this problem now, would you? And why is it that you're so keen on protecting brothels? Is that because you need to spend time there? And then there was a whole series feminist argument about sexual double standards and whose safety should be protected in the city, and shouldn't a woman be able to walk the streets of the city without being assaulted. So really extraordinary newspaper. Really, it was a newspaper war that developed and ramified up and down the nation, from Charleston to Maine. So this case became a real sensation.
One of the things you say in the book and some of the teaser materials for the book is that the impact of Lanah Sawyer's case is still felt today. How do we see it felt today? What is the legacy of Lanah Sawyer?
There's two ways of thinking about that. I think in terms of the law of rape, the impact of this case was unfortunately not great. I've argued in the book that a lot of the trial tactics developed by the defense team were really innovative. The defense team was not arguing what the law actually was. They were arguing about what they thought the law should be. And they were making very extreme arguments. They were saying things like the crime has to be reported immediately. So as soon as Lanah left Mother Carey's house, she had to immediately raise a hue and cry and have Bedloe arrested in the streets. Otherwise, her case isn't valid, for example. They argued that her not just her reputation had to be good, but that her inner character had to be good. So they speculated on how corrupt her inner character could be. The point is that they really were working very hard to make an acquaintance rape like Lanah's very difficult to prosecute. And we see in this period, we knew this, historians have known this as a broader pattern, that there was a narrowing of the definition of rape in this period to really apply primarily in practice to stranger rapes, typically in which a lower class man violently assaults a more elite woman he's unacquainted with. Classically in American history, this has been weaponized as a tool of white supremacy, a black man and a white woman. While on the other hand, acquaintance rapes like Lanah Sawyer became increasingly difficult to prosecute. And so we see one origin point for the real difficulty in prosecuting acquaintance rapes 200 years ago. And I think that should give us pause. It's at some level depressing, but it's also kind of a reality check that the current issues we have with sexual assaults, in major institutions, in workplaces, on college campuses, et cetera, it's not a problem because of how people dress. It's not a problem because of people drinking too much. It's not simply a product of any ephemeral cultural development in recent times. This is a deep-seated reluctance in American law to hold perpetrators responsible for acquaintance rapes.
You did some of this research, I guess a lot of this research during the Me Too movement itself. Mm-hmm. How did, especially as a man writing this book, how did that movement impact your scholarship and your interpretation of this event?
So I really began writing this book because I had been working as the director of UNC's program in sexuality studies at a time when sexual assault on campuses nationwide was a really powerful issue. And I tried to organize a diverse group of scholars to kind of share their understandings and what we knew about the problem we were facing, so we could start to think about strategies going forward. And I ultimately decided that as an historian, one of the contributions I could make was to investigate this case and tell the story of this case. So this case really grew out of Title IX activism at UNC. I was teaching there and thinking about this while two of our wonderful undergraduates, Andrea Pino and Annie Clark, pioneered the use of Title IX to change how college administrations deal with these issues, which was developing at the same time as the Me Too movement. Their story was told in The Hunting Ground, the movie. So I've been involved. So this book is informed by a lot of that activism. And I think a couple things come out of that for me. One was a reminder of just how important it was that Lanah Sawyer be the center of the story, that this wasn't a story about Henry Bedloe or anybody else, that I wanted to show her arc through time, that she had a background, she had a future, she made decisions. I think one thing I've really understood better is how disruptive and traumatic and lasting the damage can be from assaults like this. People respond very differently. But this incident really upturned Lanah Sawyer's life. And she fought back in a way that's very unusual. Even now, more than 2/3 of acquaintance rape survivors don't report what happened. Some say more like 85%. And you can see why from this story. Because she had an enormous courage. But this story reminds us that there was a real cost to that courage.
What became of her? I'm really curious. How did she spend the rest of her life?
Well, there's two things to remind everybody of. One is that a year after the rape trial, Lanah's family successfully sued Henry Bedloe for seduction, which was a civil matter, not a criminal matter. We actually have a crazy civil suit at the moment involving the Speaker of the North Carolina House.
That is a crazy lawsuit, I will say. That is crazy. But go ahead, please.
It's connected legally. Anyway, so she sued for seduction and she won a huge money judgment against Henry Bedloe, extraordinary money judgment against Henry Bedloe, which bankrupted him and put him in Deserts prison for several years. So Alexander Hamilton comes into the story as a lawyer trying to get Bedloe out.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I wanted to ask, but go ahead. Yeah.
And I can't say it shines a very flattering light on Alexander Hamilton, but he clearly was an effective, capable attorney trying to do the best for his client. And Lanah Sawyer, and this was something I was really interested in. You asked about research, so I did a lot of research on seduction suits because these are women, because of the suit, had premarital sex, gotten pregnant. Lanah's the only woman who filed a seduction suit in this period who I've found that wasn't pregnant. Lanah's family filed a seduction suit against Henry Bedloe, and they won this enormous money damages. Basically, a year to the date after the rape trial, in the same courtroom, a very similar kind of jury reached a completely different kind of judgment, which is interesting in itself. Henry Bedloe ended up bankrupted and spent several years in debtor's prison, where his family hired Alexander Hamilton to get him out. And there's a whole subplot about Alexander Hamilton. But Lanah Sawyer, we know a few things about, and only a few things. This trial was like kind of a lightning bolt in the night, where it illuminates very clearly the scene in the fall of 1793. And then everything else is a lot more shadowy. And that's typical for what we can know about a woman of Lanah's class in this period. But what we do know is that she got married to a man named Steinmetz. And that was probably around 1795, 1796. So a while after this seduction suit had been settled. And she moved away. I think probably to Philadelphia at first. The only other thing we really know about Lanah Sawyer particularly is that when Henry Bedloe tried to slander her 5 years after the rape trial in 1798, she didn't respond. And there were perfectly good reasons for her not to respond. The fact that she moved away, got married, didn't respond when she was publicly slandered, I think tells me, I like to imagine at least, that she developed a certain peace with what had happened, but that she was not just moving away, but also moving on with her life, that she didn't want this incident and memories of this incident and public discussion of this incident and gossip about this incident to define the rest of her life. That she wanted a new beginning, a new start somewhere else.
So I'm really curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this. This is kind of behind the scenes of the book world. How did you get the cover art? How was that produced? I thought it was just super interesting to look at that. Obviously, that's not a photograph of Lanah Sawyer. It is a photograph of someone. I'm not sure how much you know about the book design and where they got this picture from and how this was all put together. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I liked this cover. So I was very happy when they proposed it. The answer is I know nothing about it.
Okay.
Except they have, the Holt is the publisher, and they have a very talented designer, who's Emily Mahar. And they actually offered me they proposed two options. And one was this, which is a picture of a kind of a shadowy picture of a young woman in a coarse gown, looking up with a kind of resolute chin. This is not the full image of her, so it's suggestive.
Yeah.
But it has a suggestion of kind of determination and inner calm that I liked a lot. And the cover's dark, which I liked because the room begins in darkness. The book begins in darkness. And the other was a image of was supposed to be a shift, which is a linen undergarment, which was a gorgeous image. It was it was on a plexi, it was on a white background, it was illuminated from behind, so it was kind of like an X-ray image. But it was like not an 18th century shift, it was a 19th century negligee, and it was just all wrong. It was sexualized and inappropriate. So the answer is I don't know.
So I want to ask for Elizabeth Wood Sweet, who taught me to sew and a thing or two about resilience. That's your dedication. Who is she? Maybe your mother, you just mentioned her. Who is she and what did she impart about resilience?
So yeah, Elizabeth Wood Sweet is my mom. And she's why I use her maiden name Wood. She was a teacher. She ran a wonderful nursery school in the town where I grew up. And she had an amazing ability to make the best of situations. I think she had some challenges as a child. I know, she didn't get to go to the college she wanted to. My grandfather made her go to Baylor. She wanted to go to Pembroke, which was now Brown. My father was a very difficult person to be married to. And yet she made the best of that. I think one of my favorite images of my mother was from about 10 years ago when my husband and I were up in Provincetown on Cape Cod, and she was swimming in this freezing cold water off of Herring Cove on the northern tip of the Cape. And I could barely put my toes in the water. And she's out there bobbing away, having, with her, all you could really see is her hat and her face. And she finally came in and I said, Mom, how can you stand being out in that water? It's freezing. And she said, honey, I grew up swimming in Hawaii and all kinds of Charleston, and all kinds of places, Texas, all kinds of places with the warm water. And when I moved to New England, I realized that I really love swimming in the ocean. And that if I were going to keep swimming in the ocean, I'd have to get used to swimming in a cold ocean.
There you go. John Wood Sweet, the author of The Sewing Girl's Tale, a story of crime and consequences in revolutionary America. Thanks so much for being here. Check out the book. Check out his website, which is johnwoodsweet.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.